Find your future by exploring your world. The Massachusetts School of Law challenges their students to explore the important issues of our time, learning from experts in fields like politics, sports, and business law. From first-hand accounts and dramatic reenactments, in-depth conversations with society's leaders, from historians to lawyers, from high-tech professionals to environmental experts. The Massachusetts School of Law at Andover presents mslaw.edu.
Hello and welcome to mslaw.edu, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. I am Diane Sullivan, your host for today's program. Thank you for joining us. Sit back for a moment and think about who you would choose as the most influential women of the 20th century. Those women who made a difference, not just in America, but in the world. Women who have set the standard for today's women and changed our career path. Questions our guest Susan Ware must have had as she began what she called her casting call for the women in her book, Letter to the World, 7 Women Who Shaped the American Century. Our journey begins with Susan explaining how she became a writer.
I became a writer mainly because of my interest in history. I think of myself as a historian, and I'm also very interested in women's history. I became a historian about the same time I became a feminist. And so for me, the two things have always been very closely intertwined, and it's been a great privilege in my career to be able to choose topics that both spoke to my interest as a historian and also my interests as a feminist.
Oh, I imagine it would, and you've done such a wonderful job with that, and we thank you for it. Your book, Letter to the World, is about 7 women that you selected that you believe really influenced the 20th century in America. How did you select the women?
Well, I think in some ways the book started out with another character, and that character was Amelia Earhart. And I got so interested in her that she ended up getting her own book. So I did that book first, and then I thought, well, you know, Amelia Earhart isn't the only one in that period of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, these larger-than-life women. Who else is like an Amelia Earhart? So I really basically started keeping a list, or as I say in my book, it's almost like I had a casting call to think which women were similar in terms of their public presence, their popularity, and their importance for women's history. And I very quickly settled on the 7 that I chose. And of course, they were also ones that I, as a historian, was interested in and wanted to spend time with. And I also thought that my audience would be interested in them as well. And there really is a way in which each of my women, you can spend a little bit of time with her in a chapter and meet her, and then you can move on to someone else. And that was the deliberate structure. And I thought, well, what fun to be able to introduce 7 amazing women in the context of one book. And just as important, what fun for me to be able to write it.
It was a wonderful experience for me as a reader. I so much enjoyed it. So my compliments to you on that. What is the significance of the title, Letter to the World?
Well, Letter to the World originally it's an Emily Dickinson poem. It is also a Martha Graham dance. And in fact, the Martha Graham estate, which is quite protective of her legacy, for a while was threatening that I couldn't use that as a title because it was their dance. And I said, well, Emily Dickinson was there first. I think I'm on solid ground. But I loved the image because so much of what the book is about is the public personas of these women and their importance in popular culture and what they, by extension, meant to their audience. And the phrase letter to the world just seemed to sum that up so well, that their lives were their letters to the world. And now we, modern audiences who didn't necessarily grow up with them or know them, can read those letters.
Yes. Eleanor Roosevelt was your first choice, who you portray as the most significant woman in all of 20th century America.
Not just me. There's pretty much agreement about
And
that.
I agree with that. And I think most people would. Maybe Hillary is now a rival.
Yeah, that's true.
But short of that, I think we see her as probably the most inspirational woman of all. So tell us a little bit about that selection.
Well, I felt that she was so important in terms of setting a standard for what women could do in public life, both as the wife of the president and as an independent person and actor on her own. And she also seemed to have such an interesting personal trajectory, where she starts in a very traditional marriage and with low expectations for her as a woman. She could have just been a wife and mother. And she just explodes those categories and kind of runs with it and makes her way, and then makes such a difference to the world, not just to the United States, but to the world in the 20th century. And so she seemed the place to start, because if you don't start with her, then everybody else has to follow her.
That's right.
It's a hard act to follow.
Would it be accurate to say that for Eleanor, she saw the world as needing improvement, and she was about to undertake that type of improvement?
Mm-hmm. But it took her a while to get to that stage, and of course she had amazing opportunities to do it.
Why syndicated columnist Dorothy Thompson?
Well, I was to follow Eleanor Roosevelt and also to recapture someone. I think Dorothy Thompson is, of my 7 women, the one that is the least well known now, although sometimes I wonder how well any of these women are known. But
we'll talk about that.
That's another story. But she was, in the 1930s, a significant figure in terms of journalism and also the recognition of events abroad in Europe that were very quickly going to draw the United States into war. And she's someone that people read every day. I mean, there was just, everybody knew who Dorothy Thompson was. And so I think, again, to capture the way in which women were playing roles that they hadn't played before, her as a journalist and then as a syndicated columnist who's really affecting the discourse about peace and war in the 1930s and 40s, that I really wanted to give her a place. And yet I was somewhat interested in trying to figure out, well, why hasn't she had the staying power that someone like Eleanor Roosevelt did?
You label her to be a one-woman crusade against Hitler, and I think so many people didn't realize that as a part of our history.
Yeah, and it was a very important, she was saying things that needed to be said.
That's right. Thirdly, Margaret Mead. So tell us about this selection.
Well, Margaret Mead is such a fascinating character in so many ways. You think of her at age, I think it's 27, when she publishes her first book, and she becomes a media sensation. And then she goes on to write, to be both an anthropologist, but also a popularizer. Mm-hmm. And she had a presence in popular culture from her perch at the Natural History Museum in New York. And what's interesting to me is that she talked a lot about women's issues and gender. And so I was able to use her to talk about, see what people are saying about these issues
right.
from the 20s really through the 70s.
Katharine Hepburn, who you write is headstrong, who was used to getting her own way, and you felt you needed to include Hollywood. So my question is, of all the choices in Hollywood, why Katharine Hepburn?
I have always been fascinated with Katharine Hepburn. And I think in this case, it was a chance for me to write a chapter about her, because if I didn't write a chapter about her, I was likely to write a book about her. And I wasn't sure that I wanted to do that. But I also think that of all the actresses, that she especially embodies this sense of independence and being sure of herself and just full speed ahead all the time. Plus she's drop dead gorgeous. She wears pants.
Yeah.
And I've always loved her movies. Mm-hmm. The movies from the 30s, especially the black and white movies, less so the later ones. Mm-hmm. But she also had such a staying power in popular culture. And people, I think, really loved the idea of there being a Katharine Hepburn. And I think at the end of her life, she was almost Katharine Hepburn playing the part of Katharine Hepburn. Mm-hmm. But she was always my choice for Hollywood.
Next, the gifted athlete Babe. Tell us about Babe.
Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias. I think probably the most gifted athlete, male or female, of the 20th century. She could do anything, any sport. and she could beat the boys and the men. She was just amazing. And sports is such an important part of 20th century popular culture, and yet it's been very hard for women to sort of break into that, to become the superstars. Most of the sports stars we think of are men. If you think of Babe Ruth or Joe DiMaggio or Knute Rockne or whatever.
Sure.
And so I thought, well, I've got this amazing woman who starts as a track and field star in the 30s and then becomes a world-renowned golfer in the 40s and 50s before she succumbs to colon cancer at a young age in her 40s. And so for me, it was a chance to write about sports because, of course, if you think back to Katharine Hepburn and her athletic body, and like so many of the actresses in Hollywood, something that's very distinctive about 20th century women is their bodies and the way they embrace athletics. And so I thought, if I'm writing about women's history, I really need to think about sports.
One point that you make on a number of the different women is their more sturdy physical style. They weren't anorexic looking like a lot of either the athletes or the stars are today.
Well, I think in some ways popular culture was a little more forgiving to women, especially as they aged, and that they didn't feel that they had to conform to a certain style or presentation for women. Having said that, they all look pretty good when you see them in newsreels or photographs.
Martha Graham, who danced and dressed to be noticed. Why a dancer?
Because modern dance is so central to the 20th century, and you can't write about modern dance without including Martha Graham. And here she is, she's breaking away from ballet, and she is constructing a mode of dance from a woman's point of view, using a woman's body. She did have men in her troupe, but there's something very woman-centric about what she's doing. And again, this notion of the physicality of women's lives. As a historian, I keep contrasting it to the 19th century when women were encased in corsets and long dresses and couldn't move. And then here in the 20th century, you have Martha Graham in those wonderful stretchy fabric costumes that she would dance in, just showing what a woman's body could do in dance that no one had ever shown before.
And your final selection is Marian Anderson, who is your only African-American woman that was selected for the book. Tell us about this selection.
Well, I certainly was hoping to be able to include not just white women, and yet, since my theme was women who were well known in popular culture, I came up against the racism of the times, which put up much bigger hurdles to an African American becoming a well-known popular star or celebrity than a woman.
Yes.
And of course, she had both strikes against her. And yet, she just persevered. She had a gift. Her voice was just, it's just wonderful to listen to. And she really knew what she wanted to do in terms of showing what women and African Americans could do in the field of opera and music. And so for me, it was a story about taking a stand and but doing it in a quiet, private way, not out on the barricades with the civil rights, but in some ways making a similar statement. And I really thought that she belonged in this group.
Marian Anderson, distinguished American contralto, sings the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the
I'm one unlucky guy. The chance of being involved in a robbery is 1 in 757. The chances of being struck by lightning 1 in 750,000.
Please fasten your seatbelts for unexpected turbulence.
The chances of being a victim in an airline crash? 1 in 29 million. Hey, could I get some peanuts? The chances of being involved in a car crash are far greater than lightning strikes and plane crashes. And if you are texting while driving, your risk of crash increases 23 times. Now, I may be an unlucky guy, but I don't have to be part of that statistic, and neither do you. Drive responsibly.
Over 25 years ago, we said legal education was broken. Change is uncomfortable, but it's often needed. So we rolled up our sleeves and we fixed it. Schools are just too expensive. Ours isn't. Most schools don't teach needed professional skills. Ours does because our professors continue to have real-world experience. Too often, you settle for a career that's less than what you hoped for. You shouldn't. Come see the future. The Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Your future starts here.
How did these women portray new images of female achievement and celebrity status?
Well, I think the newness of them and their importance for women's history is that they are all functioning and thriving in fields that 50 or 100 years before would have been closed to women. So you have Eleanor Roosevelt becoming an ambassador to the United Nations, or you have women actresses in Hollywood, or syndicated, newspaper columnists, or opera singers. And these are all new roles that women are taking on. And so I really wanted to be able to show the sweep of the new opportunities for women, because of course that is one of the main themes of 20th century women's history.
Was there a singular characteristic or characteristics about the women that you focused in on?
Well, there's their gender. They're all women.
Yeah, that's that's one.
I think that is a big part of it. I think I was most interested in looking at their role in popular culture. I wasn't necessarily expecting to find patterns or themes, something that would, all slot them in the same way. I was more interested to see where they ended up, and then telling the story of how they got there, and then stepping back and saying, okay, well, what do these collective stories tell us about women's history? And I must say, it's tricky. You asked me about being a writer. It's tricky doing a collective biography because you've got 7 balls in the air that you're juggling, and you can't overwhelm, but you don't want to put them all in the same box. And so I found that it was a challenge, and yet I enjoyed the opportunity to introduce my readers to 7 women and then give them some context. This is what I do as a historian, for knowing why they were significant and why this might help us to understand the 20th century.
Yes, and it does a wonderful job at that. What was the media's reaction to these women now, for the first time, having several women with significant accomplishment?
I think the media was fascinated by them. And in some ways, it's sort of easy if you're the first woman or one of the first to do something. The media will say, well, look at her. It's almost like she's a curiosity. I think it gets harder when you're the number 2 or 3 or 4 woman who's doing that. Media kind of loses interest sometimes. But these were fascinating people to the media. And again, I go back to Amelia Earhart, who the press just ate her up. I mean, what she was able to accomplish as a pilot, and that no one else had done before. And so there was a way in which they're newcomers, they're of interest. People want to read stories about them. Those stories sell newspapers or propel newsreels that people want to see in the movie houses. So these women were interesting. And I think one thing that drew me to it was I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I didn't have these neat women role models in popular culture. And we had Doris Day and, I don't know, some of these other, I Love Lucy. And so I was quite fascinated that in an earlier period, the media was giving all this attention, and it was generally very positive attention. These women are not being criticized. They are being lauded for what they do and for what they mean. And I thought that that was quite interesting. And I think that, again, it shows that celebrity was a little more forgiving back then, or wasn't quite as demanding.
Right.
I don't know if any of these women would have survived in the celebrity culture of today, where everything is fair game and nobody has a private life. But back in the 20s and 30s and 40s, you really could have a public persona and keep your private life more private. And what that meant was that these women could have these incredibly high-powered, satisfying, well-paid careers, get all the public adulation, which they enjoyed and needed, but still be able to hold onto some shred of a life of their own. I'm not sure celebrities today can do that anymore.
Discuss, if you would, though, the longevity of these women's careers, which rings true even today, unlike the brief shelf life that a woman,
10
particularly,
seconds.
of 40 has.
Yeah. No, I think, again, that was one of the things that attracted me to them, that they were able, in pretty much every case except for Dorothy Thompson, to maintain a lifelong presence in popular culture. And as you just pointed out, especially for women, as they age, this is a challenge. But remember that these women were in popular culture and were being featured because they were interesting women. It wasn't because of how they looked.
Yes.
And, you know, Margaret Mead at the end of her life got quite chubby, but that was what she looked like, and that was what people expected. I think they also worked very hard at keeping themselves in the public eye. And I think there is a way that I sort of learned as I was writing, because I began to see it. Once you've been in the public eye and you've been on the cover of Time magazine, or you've had all these newspaper reporters following you around, well, if that stops, you think, well, where's my public? Why aren't people interested in me anymore? And most of these, almost all of these women actually managed to find ways to keep the public interested in them at each stage in their career up until the very end. And, you know, with Martha Graham, she had her dance company, but she was still dancing.
Yes.
And Marian Anderson was able to sing, you know, she was for quite a while, and then, you know, would do concerts, but there are ways in which then she could still keep herself in the public eye. Eleanor Roosevelt and Margaret Mead were such workaholics that they practically were working until the day they checked themselves into the hospital to die. And I think they needed that. And, you know, part of me thinks, especially with Eleanor Roosevelt, that if she had just been supposed to, when she retired, sit around and knit, she would have gone crazy. I think all these women would have. They loved being active, and they had so much to give. And I think they knew that. But they worked hard at it. You know, I think one of the themes that comes through with all these women is that nobody's handing them their success. They are working hard to make it happen.
Sure.
And that suggests that there was more than a little bit of ego and ambition behind these careers, that they really, and luck, all those things that go together in anybody's life.
Are they then role models? Do they provide a blueprint for success in today's world for women?
I think they're role models, but not necessarily in copying their specific lives or their choices. I would see them more as role models in popular culture of showing women that if there's something you want to do and someone says, no, you can't do it, then you can point to Eleanor Roosevelt and say, well, look at Eleanor Roosevelt, or look at Margaret Mead, or look at Babe Dietrichson. People told them no, and they just said, well, I'm not going to listen to that. And so in some ways, it's a way of encouraging dreams and aspirations. Now, not everybody is going to have the opportunities that an Eleanor Roosevelt did, or a Margaret Mead, for education or all kinds of things. So it's a role model, but it comes with strings.
Right.
It doesn't work for everybody. But I think it's also very important, just if there are going to be these popular figures in popular culture that are looked up to, there better be women as well as men, or young girls when they're growing up are going to get the idea that the only successful folks are men. And so I think that the importance of these women is just showing to whoever happens to pick up a newspaper or open a magazine or see a newsreel that there's an accomplished woman up there. She's not a freak. She's being treated seriously. She's making a contribution. And that says something about what women are accomplishing. It's not necessarily shouting feminism in anybody's face, but in many ways it is a statement about women's capabilities, which is, of course, what feminism is all about.
Would it be accurate to say that the women all shared a concern for meaningful work? This was very important to them.
And I think, again, if you think about the lives, the traditional lives that women have usually led, it has revolved mainly around their families. And I think what this cohort of women realized was that there are other ways than by being a wife and mother to lead an interesting life. And they had nothing but praise for the women who chose to lead those lives. But you almost get a sense that they're saying, but it's just not right for me. Right. I can do more. And of course, we've always given those options to men, and I think they're claiming them for women.
Did these women, any of them, find true love, or was it career?
Well, no, true love. How am I? I'm a historian. How can I define that? I think
traditional.
Traditional. Well, Margaret Mead had this great quote about marriage. I'm not sure I can quite bring it up, but it's something about you should always marry someone who shares your interests and will make for a wonderful marriage. And I did that with each of my 3 husbands.
Right.
So I think that she did. But many of them had quite complicated marriages. If you think about the marriage of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt, well documented, a great political partnership, but not exactly a love match.
Many of the women you write about in the book also had loving relationships with women. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Well, I think that's one of the things that probably will surprise people now. I think we're living in an age, in the 21st century, where all of a sudden we're much more aware of people who are identified as gay. And yet there's a whole past history to that where many women would be in relationships with women, sometimes they'd be in relationships with men. It wasn't all so cut and dried. And part of it was an element of an experimentation. And there was also more freedom to do it because it was a little more private. You didn't have to make a public statement to the world about your sexuality. And yet I think it is important for us to include those kinds of relationships between women in our understanding of how women have lived their lives, the history of homosexuality, the place that plays, and just how much more accepted or more prevalent perhaps than people would realize it was.
A little bit of a different topic. Hepburn and Graham carry on long-term relationships with men who could not or would not leave their wives. Why?
Maybe it had its benefits. I think Katharine Hepburn got to have a relationship with Spencer Tracy that lasted for many years. When you actually look at the amount of time they spent together, it's not actually all that much, and yet I think they both benefited from a sense of being a couple. And with Martha Graham, it's complicated. I mean, she was so involved in her work, and she was just so focused on it. It's really hard to imagine her in a relationship, a traditional relationship.
Am I wrong to think that perhaps these women didn't want to ultimately ever have to subordinate themselves to a man, so it was easier to have a relationship as opposed to a marriage?
Yeah, I think that's probably true because, of course, these women are all trying to sort of make up their lives as they go along. This is before the modern feminist movement of the 60s and 70s that taught women like me that I had choices and that I could do what I want. There really wasn't an active public feminist movement at the time that was helping them think those things through. And they're sort of, as I said, making it up as they go along.
I wonder if you might comment on Marian Anderson, who is criticized by the media for marrying a man, or maybe the general public even, who passes as white. I wonder if you would shed any light on that.
Well, it's a very complicated question in the African American community, the question of passing. And yet, people did know that he was African American. And so I think that there's a way in which there isn't so much that you can really say about that, except that it is very much of that moment in the 40s and 50s. And that for some people, the only way to have a professional career was to be able to pass. Right. And I think that just speaks to how deeply ingrained the racism was at the time. Right. It's not that we don't still live in a society where racism is a factor, but in the 40s and 50s, the South was still segregated legally, and it's a very different world. And so what you have is a marriage that's trying to navigate some of those complications. Sure. And of course, Marian Anderson had to do it too when she would travel. And if she's staying in a hotel, would she be welcome in the dining room? Right. Or should she have dinner in her room? Luckily, those kind of things don't happen anymore, but they were just a fact of life for her.
You write in the book that the high number of divorces, Mead with 3, attests to the difficulty that women had and still continue to have if they are successful, independent women in maintaining a mutually satisfying relationship with a man. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Well, I think the numbers do kind of speak for themselves.
They do, don't they?
But I do think it is difficult, and especially when you have a marriage. Let's say Dorothy Thompson, who was married to Sinclair Lewis, the writer, a complicated guy, and would have been a challenging husband for anybody. And then you've got Dorothy Thompson, who's, I was going to say jetting off to Europe, but it's the 30s, so she would have been taking the boat to get there. But when you've got such a large career and your work is really so central, you're traveling a lot, I think if it can put demands on the other person. They can feel left out, and it really does take quite an unusual man to be willing to play second fiddle.
Right. Let's talk for a moment about motherhood. Roosevelt had 5 surviving infancy. Most of these women do not have children. I wonder if you'd comment on why.
Well, partly that comes from not having husbands, but that's not...
Well, yeah, I guess. It doesn't stop us today, though, does it?
A different time. I mean, my sense as a women's historian is that in some ways I can see patterns where there's there stages that first, in the late 19th century, if you really wanted to have a professional career, you had to stay single. There was no way that Jane Addams, for example, could have been married and also run Hull House. But then in this sort of middle generation, there's a sense of, well, maybe you could be married and have a career and have those two in a kind of unsettled balance, but trying to keep them that way. If you throw in kids at that point, then it gets really difficult. And then if you fast forward, let's say to the 60s and 70s, then we start to have this struggle that so many of us have dealt with of having the career, having the marriage, and having the family in a society that is not really structured to make this an easy thing for women or men to do. So my sense is that for women of this generation and at that time, they maybe would try the marriage, but to also embrace having children would have been really hard.
Too much.
Is
it accurate to say that these women thought more in individualistic terms, which might be a reason they didn't at least appear publicly to jump on the feminist movement?
I think they very much did, and it sort of makes sense. I try to put myself back in their shoes, and if I were a Margaret Mead or a Dorothy Thompson, I would really think of myself as having fought my way up whatever the career ladder and been successful and had barriers as a woman, but I surmounted them. And now I'm here. It's me. I did it. And that kind of trajectory doesn't really encourage a sense of thinking of women as we, that all women are part of this. And so I think that there is a way in which they often thought of themselves as individuals. And of course, American culture, with its focus on individual success and achievement encourages that. So in
Sure.
some ways, the women are tapping into that. What is too bad is that I have a sense that if they had had a little broader gender consciousness or feminist consciousness as women, they might have been a little more outspoken on some of the problems they faced as women, some of the commonalities of women's lives. But again, this is a period where there is not an active feminist movement. And so I think one of the reasons why they're so important is they're living lives of what I call applied feminism. They're living feminist lives as new women. They're showing us how that can be done. They're just not necessarily linking it to an ideology, but if that's all there is at the time, and you see those models, you can draw those lessons.
How did these women view aging, and did they need that adoring public to sustain them?
Well, if you go back to the question earlier about meaningful work, and that really defined each of these women. They loved their work, and so of course you want to be able to continue that. If you love your work, you don't want to retire. What would retirement mean? And I think each of them had that sense of wanting to continue, but sometimes you need someone to pay the bills, you need someone to pay attention, and so you have to make sure that people are still interested in what you're doing. But I think for them it was a matter of almost self-preservation.
Yes. Yeah, that's the sense one would gather from reading your book.
Yeah, that they really needed it. And yet if you're thinking about a model of aging, being so involved in what you love doing, it's not such a bad one.
No, it's a very good one, actually. How would you like us to remember these women in history?
Well, I think mainly I just hope people know who they are. That's sort of a battle. And yet, of course, it is one reason why, as a historian and a women's historian, I love writing books, because I know that by writing a book and writing a biography, that I'm helping to keep these women in history, give them their place.
Yes.
But I think beyond that, I think their significance really lies in their courage and their ambition and their unwillingness to let anybody say no to them. There's just something very appealing about the determination with which they lived their lives, which generalizes far beyond just the 20s and 30s. And I think that some of those qualities really do speak to us still today.
How would they wish to be remembered in history?
Well, I think they really would want to be remembered. And so that is key. I think there you go to each individual field. And certainly Martha Graham is so central to modern dance, and Marian Anderson in terms of classical music. So they would see that as their field and really want to be able to be recognized alongside comparable women and also the comparable men. Again, it's when we think of whatever field it is, we want to make sure that our vision includes women as well as men. And that's why we need women's history, because unfortunately, without writing these women into history, like the history of journalism, then we lose Dorothy Thompson.
It's a short ride from your neighborhood to your naturehood. find fun activities to do, like boating and biking, or camping and hiking, plus much more. To find a neighborhood park or green space near you, visit discovertheforest.org.
I remember the day my future started. Walking with Bo, thinking about my life. I had big dreams, but my career was going nowhere. That's when I discovered the Massachusetts School of Law. A few years later, I'm here with Bo, but now I'm thinking about my clients' problems instead of my own.
Teachers with real-world experience, a fun campus, and the most affordable law school in New England. Change your life. The Massachusetts School of Law at Andover. Your future starts here.
Let's take a few minutes and talk a little bit more about some of the women in more significant detail. Eleanor Roosevelt. Discuss her desire to be self-supporting, which is very interesting for the time.
Well, I think one of the things that really has struck me is when I think the President of the United States was paid $75,000 in the 1930s. So Franklin, that's his salary. Eleanor made sure that she made that much, if not more, from her syndicated column, from her newspapers, from the lecturing that she did. And so clearly something was at work there, that she wanted to show that she was as important and financially, that she could earn her own way. And, you know, again, she comes from an upper class family. Her traditional life would have been as a dependent wife. And I think she feels very proud and modern that she can earn as much as her husband does, who happens to be President of the United States.
She says, and you quote in the book, and let me read it to you, when you cease to make a contribution, you begin to die. And she says that at age 75. That is very telling.
Well, as I said, she was really out there and really until she checked into the hospital to die. And that really was her philosophy. And one of the things I admire so much about her is that she had a way of always being open to new people. I think, I find as I age that I'm not always open to making new friends or bringing new ideas or new people into my life. That was not true of Eleanor. She was always interested in what young people were doing, what people in walks of life that she didn't know about. She would invite them to her house. She would invite them to dinner. She wanted to learn from them. And there's this curiosity that she never loses. But part of that is also, I think, it's a way for her to fill her time. She would, if she didn't have that constant input, then she were just sitting on her couch by herself, I think she would have been pretty miserable. But she was able to use her curiosity about people and then use it to fuel her new interests. It would just lead her in new ways, the way she became so interested in civil rights at the end of her life, for example.
Dorothy Thompson was not seen as one of the boys. She liked women, had very close friendships with women, which was different for a columnist of that time.
But in some ways, she was one of the boys. You know, if you think also about the other roles for women in journalism at the time, there was the women's page. That was where most women journalists were consigned, and they hated it. They knew they could be good reporters, but they were told they were only supposed to be writing about social news. And so I think one of the things that's so distinctive about Dorothy Thompson is she says, I'm not going that route. I am going to be one of the boys. I'm going to do the most male thing there is in journalism, which is covering international affairs. And she did it. So I think in that sense she was, and yet in her personal life, she was very interested and involved in a women's world. So again, there's an interesting balance there.
Margaret Mead is highly recognizable with that forked walking stick. Was that by design?
I think she adopted it at one point and then realized that it served her purposes.
Okay.
It really is like a badge, the way if someone always wears a certain hat or you know, dresses in a certain way. And it's like branding. That's what I was looking for.
Okay.
And there really was a Margaret Mead brand. And it's one that she worked very hard at doing. And yet it's interesting, here she's an anthropologist. How many other anthropologists can you think of
None.
that have become popular figures or
Right.
intellectuals? And so it's, she was really good at it.
Why did she study women and children?
I think she was very interested in them, and it also was a way to get a new perspective on a culture.
I wondered if in part it was so she wasn't competing with the men so much.
Well, sometimes women do choose topics just because they're not seen as important, but then I would turn it around and say, but she had insights on these societies that she studied that would not have occurred
That's right.
if they had only been looking at the public leaders and the men.
Yes, great point.
And so I think in that sense, she sort of took it and used it to her own purposes, but then also used it to get people thinking about things. I mean, her first book about coming of age in Samoa is about adolescence.
Yes.
It was a topic that was very much on people's minds in the 1920s, because these young girls were growing up in very different ways than their mothers had. And so she's able to tap a topic, female adolescence, but also pitch it in a way that it resonates in American culture, and that's what she did so well.
Her idea not to speak out against anything, but to always speak positively.
Wouldn't that be nice today?
That was a very short-lived idea.
No, I think that was her approach.
She was subject, though, to heavy criticism after death, you point out in the book. Why was that?
Well, she was a controversial figure in many ways. I think that some of her anthropology findings have not necessarily held up, but nobody's research from the 20s and 30s really has. And whenever I see something like that where someone's really gunning to shoot down the reputation of a woman, I think there's some other agenda here.
Okay.
That they're going after her because she's a woman and she's threatening, and that probably wouldn't have happened to a man, that his work would then have been seen as an important step, but then perhaps later it's been revised, but when it's a woman and she's an uppity woman, here's a chance to shoot her down. And if Margaret Mead had been alive, well, while she was alive, she did fight back.
Katharine Hepburn, who you pointed out earlier is perhaps the most independent of women, what role did her mother play in all of that?
Oh, she had a wonderful suffragist mother who also was active in the birth control movement. Same name, Katharine Houghton Hepburn. Two of them share the same name. And I think that it was an important role model for the actress, seeing such a strong woman, and yet her mother didn't have a public career. She was more of a volunteer. And so Hepburn would get certain messages, but then she saw a mother who really devoted her life to her children. And I think the actress knew she didn't want that kind of life. And yet how lucky to grow up in a household where topics like birth control and suffrage are being talked about at the dining room table.
Yes.
And that's quite an upbringing for a girl.
And something you mentioned earlier, and you write about in the book, is that Hepburn says being a mother, being a wife, most important job in the world. But if you don't want to do it, if it's not right for you, then don't do it.
Yeah. And luckily she knew that. And she was able to act on that.
Why did Hepburn herself think that she lived like a man?
Well, I think she probably didn't have the vocabulary for realizing that she'd actually lived like a woman, just a different kind of woman.
Okay.
And I hope that if she had been of a younger generation, she would have framed it in a slightly different way. But I think for women of that time, very often they really were so different from the traditional gender roles for women, which would be still as a housewife and a mother. And so unless you think there are three sexes, there's men, there's women, and there's me, you really almost do have to think of yourself as being like a man.
Yeah, fair point.
And yet, she's definitely a woman. And so I think that one of the things we always need to remember is she was able to accomplish these things as a woman. And we shouldn't deny that, even if she says, oh, I'm just acting like a man.
Babe, you point out, most talented athlete could beat the men. I hope you'd reiterate that again. I want the audience to hear she can beat the men.
Anybody. She was just amazing as an athlete. And I think really shows us how women's athletic accomplishments and what they can do, we have no idea of how talented women are. And you get someone like Babe and she just blows everybody else away, then you should be starting to think, well, it's not just her. Let's see what other women athletes can do if given a chance. And so for me, that is the legacy of Babe Dietrichson. It's like, don't put any barriers in the way of women in terms of competition. Let them play with the boys if they want, because they're going to be able to do just fine.
You point out in the book that when she's stricken with cancer, she believes it's a battle to be won, that she can overcome it. But she died a long, slow, painful death.
She did. And unfortunately, like many athletes, she didn't really recognize the signs as early. And also we need to remember, this is the 1950s, and cancer, people didn't talk about having cancer or weren't even necessarily told a diagnosis if they'd had it. And I find it quite admirable the way when she returned to the golf tour after having had surgery, that she talked about it, and she really became a role model of a more openness about cancer. And I think that's what drew people to her, including Dwight Eisenhower, who really mentioned that at a press conference after she died. And it wasn't just because she was a golfer. It was because of this public battle that she had faced, but unfortunately it was one that she was not able to win. I'm not sure what she would have done after if she had lived. I mean, it's interesting in some ways to think about these women who check out just at about the right time. Of course, Amelia Earhart is a perfect example of that.
Martha Graham, discuss her dramatic personal presentation.
Well, if you're a dancer, you're a performer. And if you're a performer, you can't just turn it off when you get off the stage. And I think that's part of it. It is also, I think, a statement about her uniqueness. I mean, she wanted people to know who she was. And she was able
and she achieved that.
She did. And she was able to achieve a personal style that was instantly recognizable. And also, once you've got that style, when you wake up in the morning, you don't have to figure out what you're going to wear. You just put it on.
But what's so interesting, you point out in the book that she has no mirrors in her studio. Why is that?
I think to her, the vision of dance is so interior, and the body, that it's not dependent on what you see, it's what the body is producing, and that's the most important thing.
And a point you also make somewhere in the book is she doesn't see it as her job to be beautiful or pretty. That's not, something that she has to do for the public.
Yeah, no, I think she wants to be distinctive.
Yes.
But she's not, and that's also, I think, a reaction to ballet, because if you think about ballet, there are those women in their little tutus, and they're supposed to be beautiful, even though they're incredibly athletic. And so she's reacting against that with the starkness of the costumes that her dancers wore that really are to draw attention to the dance movement, not to the costume.
What was it like to work in her company?
I imagine that if you had Martha Graham for a boss, you probably expected to get phone calls at 2 in the morning and to be working every weekend and be at her beck and call. It's a way, I think in some ways it's true of many people, creative people in the theater. It is just, it's 24/7. And also she was the visionary, and the people who worked with her were trying to implement that vision. So they were taking orders from her, they were following her directions, they were trying to implement her vision. And I suspect it would have been hard, and yet what an education that would be. And then when you look and you see the women that she trained, and men, who then went on to found all of the major dance companies across the United States, you see the influence that she had, and it's truly phenomenal. But I imagine while it was going on, it probably wasn't all that pleasant. I think she would have been a hard person to be around.
You write that she's a loner, believing that really nothing significant is accomplished by a group.
Well, in some ways, it is interesting that she founds a dance company.
Yes.
Where there is a group, and while she has some solo dances, many of her dances do involve social groups. If you think about Appalachian Spring, where it tells a story and there are characters in it. And so there's a slight disconnect there. And yet I think for the creation, for her own vision, she really did need to be alone. And that may be true of general creative types, male and female. But again, to go back to the fact that it is a woman who's doing it is what we need to notice and mark and celebrate.
Marian Anderson, your last woman, who you say really reflects, is a mirror to race relations of the time. She has perhaps, though, the most traditional relationship of all the women with her husband. Is that accurate?
I think that is accurate. And also, she is the most private person, the person who is less out there in the public eye up until the very end. I think of the two of them up at their farm in Connecticut, spending weekends up there, by themselves when she's not touring. And you get a sense of someone like Martha Graham. She's not going to be spending weekends in the country. She's going to want to be right in New York City in the middle of everything. Same with Margaret Mead. And so there's a privateness, a core, I think, to her being, which the marriage and the being able to go up to the farm. And also, I'm sure it was a relief as a break from touring. I try to think about what it would be like to be a performer and constantly be traveling, staying in hotels, doing concerts, and then you go back at the end of the night and you're in a hotel room. She actually used to travel with a sewing machine so that she would have something to do, and just trying to keep the semblance of a normal life in a very unnormal situation. And then you add in the racism that she faced. Must have been hard. So I think for her, the withdrawing to Connecticut was probably very necessary and important.
And the final discussion about her is the fact that she refuses, as quiet as she is, she's very strong, she refuses to sing in segregated halls. There's only certain songs that if they meet with her approval, she will in fact sing.
Yeah, I really think she deserves more credit for her role in the civil rights, the broadly defined the civil rights movement, because her public stands, and especially with Eleanor Roosevelt with the Daughters of American Revolution, and that's the 30s. That is a really important turning point, and I think she deserves credit for that.
Last question. Discuss the friendship of Eleanor and Marian.
I think that well, I would put it this way. Eleanor Roosevelt had such a capacity for friendship, and when events conspired to throw her together with Marian Anderson, then you can see her thinking, well, this is someone I wouldn't have met otherwise, and also how can we work together? And this realization that the two of them were really shared a vision of a world where race was not the central defining, where there was not racial discrimination, and a world of humanity and not racism. And that common bond, I think, was very important to them. And when you think about how you make friends, how you meet people, how you connect with them, meeting them over shared values is a wonderful way of making a connection. And it also can be a very lifelong connection. It's one, that bond that it's made, then it continues. You may not be in contact with a person all that often, but when circumstances bring you together again, it's there, and you pick up where you left off.
Susan, I cannot thank you enough for sharing all this information with us, some of which I never knew.
Well, that is the joy of being a writer and a historian, and having stories about women's lives that I can bring to new audiences. And so I love doing it on the page, but I also love talking about it. And so I thank you for having me.